The travel industry saw a significant impact very quickly after the earthquake occurred in Japan on March 11th and the subsequent tsunami and nuclear crisis in the Fukushima prefecture. Governments around the world started issuing travel warnings against all but essential travel to Japan, and then later escalated those warnings to advise their citizens of evacuating the country. As a result, many expatriates and tourists heeded those warnings and have left the country either to return home or to go to nearby cities in Asia Pacific, such as Hong Kong and Singapore. Additionally, even some Tokyo residents are either traveling internationally to sort of wait out the situation at the damaged nuclear power plant, or headed further south to other cities such as Osaka, again, to wait out what may evolve into a significant nuclear crisis there. We've also seen an impact on the airline industry. Many airlines have cut back on their schedules and cut their capacity to Japan. For example, Delta estimates that it will cut capacity to the country by about 15 to 20% through May due to the drop in inbound demand. The recovery in tourism is likely to begin when the situation at the nuclear power plant is resolved and radiation levels return to normal. Unfortunately, there's no clarity on when that might happen. In fact, the U.S. government's travel warning is still in place until April 1st, so certainly through the end of March, we're going to see a lot of tourists avoiding Japan. Under our best case scenario, we assumed that the crisis at the nuclear power plant would be resolved by the end of April, and under our worst case scenario, we thought that it would be resolved by the end of June. When trying to understand the impact that the crisis will have on incoming tourism, we looked at different crises throughout the globe. We did look at what happened to Thailand after the tsunami occurred in December 2004. In fact, Thailand only saw arrivals drop by 1%, and incoming tourist receipts only fell by 5% in 2005. A swift reconstruction of the tourist areas led many tourists to come back in greater numbers in the second half of the year, sort of stabilizing the situation. While possible that Japan experiences such a minimal impact on incoming tourism, it's highly unlikely. Instead, we decided to look at the H1N1 crisis in Mexico to see sort of what happened there, and is that more of a similar situation. And given that the epidemic pretty much shut down Mexico economically and tourism-wise, we feel that that was a better scenario to look at and compare to what's going on in Japan. For instance, Mexico City was actually closed by the government from May 1st through May 5th to help stem the spread of the epidemic. This is certainly very similar to what's going on with Tokyo, with people staying indoors due to rolling blackouts and fears of radiation in the air. As a result of the H1N1 crisis, we saw that arrivals to Mexico at the height of the crisis, arrivals were down by about 50%. This is likely what's going on in Japan. To analyze the potential impact that the crisis in Japan will have on incoming tourism, we took the monthly growth rates from Mexico during the H1N1 epidemic and used those as a base to estimate, what was currently happening at the height of the crisis, and then kind of what the recovery timeline would be. Now, starting in August, we assumed that arrivals would normalize, and we used the average growth rates month over month from the historic time period of 1997 and 2010, assuming that from August through December, things will return to normal. And as a result, under this best case scenario, we predict that there would only be a 9% decline in incoming tourists. We also did look at the spending figures for Mexico, and the spend per person dropped by about 5% as incoming tourists spent less due to discounting. Using that metric, we kind of estimated that incoming tourist receipts would fall by 12% under this best case scenario. Under a worst case scenario, we used the sort of experience that Mexico had for the full year. Even after the H1N1 crisis passed, Mexico still struggled to attract tourists to the country because of the economic recession as well as fears related to drug violence. Under this scenario, we assumed that Japan may have difficulty attracting tourists even after the nuclear crisis had passed. Overall, under the worst case scenario, we would expect a 21% drop in tourists' arrivals with a 24% decrease in incoming tourist receipts. The impact on domestic tourism is a little bit harder to discern. Right now, we're probably seeing an uptick in domestic tourism as Tokyo residents leave and relocate temporarily to other parts of Japan. However, overall, we have noticed that domestic tourism tends to be a little bit more resilient during times of crisis. Domestic tourists return to the impacted areas first, lured often by promotions. People also go to the impacted areas to help reconstruct the area, and domestic tourists tend to just shift and substitute other destinations. Overall, the impact is likely to be great. The Northeastern coast accounted for about 10% of domestic trips in 2010, and since the devastation there is high, it is unlikely that those trips will be taken in 2011. However, on the brighter side, Tokyo, once the issue is resolved, is likely to see a very strong and quick rebound as people return to the city for domestic tourism. When determining what might the impact be on outgoing tourism, we decided to look at the SARS epidemic that went from about November 2002 through July 2003. During this time period, Japanese people were hesitant to travel abroad because of health-related concerns. We used growth rates from the SARS experience, those monthly declines, and applied it to the 2010 monthly data that we have for outbound Japanese tourism from the Japan National Tourism Organization. And in the best case scenario, we assumed that the recovery would begin in May, so things would get less worse. And then we assumed that things would normalize in August and return to their average growth rates for the full year. Under this best case scenario, we would expect that outgoing departures would fall by 11%. However, when we were analyzing the spend per traveler during the SARS epidemic, we noticed that it actually increased during that time period. Given the increase in travel prices that most of Asia Pacific is experiencing, and since that's the largest destination for Japanese travelers, we assumed that spend per traveler could still increase for 2011. And as a result, outgoing tourism expenditure is expected to only fall by 8% under this scenario. Now, for the worst case scenario, we assume that there is no strong recovery in outgoing departures from Japan, much like what we saw in the SARS scenario. And so we applied those monthly growth rates for the rest of the year. Under this worst case scenario, we would expect that outgoing tourists from Japan would fall by about 21%, and outgoing tourism expenditure would only fall by 17% for 2011. The decline in Japanese tourists is likely to impact Asia Pacific greatly. About a third of Japanese departures are to those countries, and during the height of the SARS epidemic, they experienced anywhere between 70 to 90% declines in Japanese arrivals during that time period. The U.S. is also expected to be hard hit by the decline in Japanese tourists, in particular the West Coast, but also Hawaii. Japanese tourists are the #1 source market for international visitors to the islands and the largest spenders. Already, Hawaii is investigating the situation and trying to determine where they might be able to promote the islands to compensate for the fall in Japanese tourists. Aside from that, though, Tokyo is a major hub that connects Asia Pacific to the Americas, and many people are avoiding transiting through Tokyo, not even spending time there. So with those fears of radiation and power outages in the city, we could see sort of a decline in arrivals between the two regions because it becomes more difficult to travel there. There are other hubs where people might try to substitute traveling through Seoul in South Korea or Taipei in Taiwan instead of going through Tokyo, but those hubs are much smaller and certainly probably cannot overcome the lack of capacity in Tokyo to connect the two regions. And as a result, there could be a significant decline in sort of that cross-regional tourism.